don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that you don't help where where there's legitimate needs, or neighbors or other church members who are struggling. But the tithe is something we return to bless His most precious possession, which is His church here on this earth.
Hi, I'm Xander, and this is the Days Before You podcast. Growing up, I often heard about tithes and offerings, and for a long time, it just felt like it was something you were supposed to do at church. 10% every time, no questions. But I feel like no one really talked about the why behind it, or what it's actually supposed to do in our hearts. Money and church in the same sentence can make people tense up. Tithing can be an uncomfortable topic. So what's the point? Is tithing and offering just a church tradition, or does it actually matter to my faith? And let's be real, when money's tight, the idea of tithing can feel overwhelming or even frustrating. So what does Scripture actually say about tithing? Why does it matter? And what's the difference between giving to the church versus giving to a charity? And what does tithing say who God is? In this episode, we invited George Crumley, who at the time of recording this was the Vice President for Finance at the Kentucky-Tennessee Conference. George's career in finance spans over 40 years, many of which were served at local church conferences. We are recording this episode just a few days before his retirement, so we are honored to have him as a guest with us today. So George, hello. Thank you for coming on today.
Hey, good to be here. Good to be here with you.
I appreciate that. Well, wanted to first congratulate you on your retirement. That's got to be an exciting thing coming up for you.
It's exciting. It's all, it's kind of sobering too. I mean, to work this many years for the church, which I've loved, and then you realize, that portion is going to come, to an end. Yeah. But and I've always enjoyed every place I've been and the people I've worked with, and so it'll be a bit of a loss from that standpoint, but heading in a bit of a new direction in retirement. So, yeah.
Well, I'm excited for you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I guess we could start this conversation off, and you have so much experience in both as a man of faith yourself, and as somebody with a full financial career and background. So if you could explain to us, what does the biblical stance for tithing, and what the difference between tithing and offering is?
That's a really good question. A biblical basis for tithing, tithing is talked about in Genesis early on. I mean, you have Abram when he went out to kind of save or deliver Lot, who had been captured, and he took back, you could say, everything he'd taken. When he went back and delivered Lot, he took all those things, those material things, and he paid a tithe on that to Melchizedek. And ultimately, he didn't keep much of that. I think he, kept some of it to feed people who had helped him and been with him, but it was returned to the king there, and but he paid tithe on that. So that's really the first recorded instance where you have the paying of tithe in the Old Testament. And then about 14 chapters later, you have Jacob, as he's kind of going out and he's feeling alone, and he's not quite he's not quite sure about what his future holds, and he asks God to be with him and watch over him, protect him, and bless him. And he says, of all that you give me, I'll give you a tenth. So there's that commitment he made. So both Abram practiced tithing, Jacob practiced tithing. You see in Deuteronomy chapter 12 and chapter 14, it talks about people, the Israelites returning a tithe. And there's even a designated place. It talks about the designated place to return the tithe. And ultimately they call that the storehouse. But, because people had the tendency to do, everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. And so there was a designated place to return to tithe. And so there you see in Deuteronomy 12 and 14, you see them returning tithe and to support the Levites, because the Levites didn't receive any sort of a land inheritance, but they had a ministry to perform, and so it was to support the Levites there. And then, of course, you see in Malachi chapter 3, the one probably we're most familiar with, in Malachi chapter 3, where the people had apostatized. They turned away. Even the Levites, the leaders, they had apostatized. They turned away from God. And God is saying, hey, you've robbed me. And they say, wherein have we robbed? In tithes and offerings, you robbed me in your tithes and offerings. And he basically says, return your tithes and offerings, and I'm going to open the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing that you won't even be able to receive it. It doesn't say what kind of a blessing. It just says, I'm going to pour you out a blessing you won't even be able to receive it. And so, there you have a very strong emphasis on tithing there in Malachi. And then in the New Testament, it's talked about less, but even the Sabbath is talked about less in the New Testament than the Old Testament. In the New Testament, the Pharisees, they were returning a tithe, and Christ commended them on that, on returning a tithe. But he also told them to focus on the weightier matters, such as faith and mercy and justice and those kinds of things. So it's talked about throughout the Bible. There's a biblical basis for it. And, we're not the only denomination that returns tithe. There's other denominations, across North America or other places that do return a tithe. So, we're not the only group of people who do that. But it's definitely based on Scripture in terms, some of the refined details. These are more principles that are communicated and conveyed in Scripture. But it's there in Scripture.
Oh, great. Wow. Yeah, so I want to go back real fast because you mentioned the Pharisees and how those are the people who acted out with the tithes and, actually presented those, however often they did, and they did everything correctly,
You're right.
But however, obviously we know also the Pharisees were not the most connected spiritually.
That's right.
Put it that way. So is going with tithing and offering, is there supposed to be a spiritual connection or that we feel when we give tithe, or how does that work within ourselves?
It is a principle. And I think the overarching theme of tithing has to be grounded and based on love. But not every single day do you feel love per se. So love ultimately, at times when you don't have the feelings, is still a faithfulness component related to love. You're right. I mean, the Pharisees, they were bankrupt in terms of any sort of, spiritual connection with God. I mean, they were extremely doing the right things, every little detail. And they were ignoring the more important principles, such as justice and mercy and, faith and love, how they treated people. And they were returning a tithe. But just because they were bankrupt, God commended them still for what they had done. Or Christ commended them still for what they had done in terms of returning a tithe. He just was saying, you guys need to focus on these really important items too, such as justice, mercy, love, some of those things, faithfulness or faith. So that's a good question. It has to be, you can be doing it for the wrong motives, and it can be a works orientation. If I do this, if I do this, if I do this, I will have God's favor if I do these things. God does ultimately want us to give out a loving heart. Yep.
So going off of that, if we're giving out of love, why is it important to give to the church versus, a charity that I might really appreciate or be passionate about, or like some other ministry where I want the money to go to? Why is it important to give it to the church and then have them decide where it goes?
That is a really good question. You look in the Old Testament, it's very clear that there was a designated location, a designated place. And so, you had the confusion in the Old Testament during the time of the Judges where everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. And I think that what has happened within the Adventist church is when you go ahead and give to the storehouse, what we call the conference, give to the storehouse, and there's a sharing of the tithe, and we may talk about that a little later on. The beauty of giving to the church is, first of all, Ephesians chapter 5 talks about Christ's most precious possession, which is his church here on earth. That's his most precious possession. And so, and the reason that that's his most precious possession is because it's through the church that principles of grace can be communicated, distinctive truths regarding the blessedness of the Sabbath and a Sabbath rest can be conveyed through the church. The hope of a second coming can be conveyed through the church. If you give to help, a specific individual, if you give to, provide food or to help a nonprofit group build housing, those are all really good things, and we need to be doing those things. But the real life-changing work takes place through the church, because that's where change takes place in the heart by God's grace. And then as people's hearts are changed, they're completely transformed. They have lives of hope instead of discouragement. And so that's why, I believe the church is so important. And it's amazing, within our church, the Adventist church, we're over 22 million people worldwide. When I was born in 1960, there was about 1 million Adventists. So you just imagine that in the last so many years, it's gone to over 22 million. And I've thought many a time, as I've worked in nonprofit church finance over the years, I've thought many a time, because of the tithing structure and the principle, that we do have a worldwide church. We have a sharing of the tithe that takes place. We're not congregational in nature where everything is kept locally. And so I believe that by God's grace and through the structure of tithing, we have a unified worldwide church that helps us to continue to grow worldwide. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that you don't help where where there's legitimate needs, or neighbors or other church members who are struggling. But the tithe is something we return to bless his most precious possession, which is his church here on this earth.
Yeah. That's fair. So if we are his greatest possession, like you're saying, and then, as individuals, a lot of people, might have various financial statuses, let's say. So for some people, sometimes, a 10% tithe could be a huge difference in their livelihood, like going from paycheck to paycheck or something like that. So for those people who it might be a little bit more of a struggle to give, is it still important for them to give tithe?
That's another good question. And that's a question many people have. Let me give an illustration. Let's assume, and I'm talking out of the mouth of a new grandfather, okay? Our
Which
daughter.
Also congratulations.
Our daughter and her husband, they had a baby boy, Theo, back in December. And, you think of a young family, they may not have, whoever it is, at certain stages of their life, they may not have as much in terms of resources they would like. Mm-hmm. But I guarantee you, when there's someone that they really love who comes into the home as a newborn, they're going to make sure that their primary focus in terms of providing for their needs is going to go to them first, and then their needs as parents become secondary. Mm-hmm. And with tithing, God's most precious possession, and you love God, you love Christ, you love his church, you want to make that your primary focus. And it's interesting, I have experienced it in my own life, but I've also heard many stories over the years where people, they didn't have the resources, where they thought, how are we going to make it? How are we going to pay our rent? How are we going to pay our mortgage, or how are we going to buy groceries, or how are we going to pay the medical bill, or whatever. And, I've heard stories about people struggling. Should I really pay tithe, But my observation has always been, and even experience has been, if you pay tithe first, if you're faithful with God first, that other 9/10, he just somehow multiplies that. It's like the loaves and the fishes. He just multiplies that. And so, and I've seen people who, were running short and they chose not to pay tithe, and I see how they struggled. But I see those who stepped out in faith and they paid tithe, and how I've heard testimonies of how they said, we couldn't believe how God came through for us in the end. I have this book here, Over and Over Again. Mm-hmm. This is volume 2. Okay, Over and Over Again, volume 2. There's a volume 1, and this is probably sold in the ABC. This is 150 Adventist share testimonies. They're just short, page-long stories, roughly. And it is fun to go through and read those testimonies, because you hear things where they didn't know how in the world they were going to make it financially. And they were tempted not to return a tithe, but they returned a tithe. And time and again, they just share, the outcome, how God did amazing things in their lives by them being faithful. So, yeah, the human nature side is, I'm just not going to make it if I pay that tithe, that 10%. But the reality is God is always faithful. He promises to open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing that we can't even receive it. So, yeah, he'll always be faithful. Yeah. But it is a step of faith.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
So it might seem risky, but, it's almost always worth it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So I feel like we need to take a step back for a second and go back to and define, or can you define for us what the difference is between tithing and offering is?
Tithing is something we return. It's not ours. It really belongs to God. It's something we return. Offerings we provide as we're able, as God has blessed us. So you return your tithe. You take that step of faith, because it's in a sense it's a test of loyalty. But I don't want to make it sound negative by saying it's a test of loyalty. That may sound negative.
Yeah,
it's not, because God blesses so much. But offerings, we go ahead and pay those as we're able, as He's blessed us. And so, and we may talk about that more in a few minutes in terms of, different offerings or how the tithe is used and some of those things. But yeah, there's a distinct difference. And so people take that step of faith and return their tithe, but as God blesses them, then they may have more ability to be faithful in their offerings.
Yeah. Well, that actually perfectly leads into my next question. And the next topic is I'm sure you could get very technical with this question, but let's for the average viewer, can you summarize just how the tithing works within the church?
Yeah.
And I guess offering as well. If I'm somebody who's giving my 10% at the church, where does the money go? How is it decided where it goes and all that stuff?
This is we could talk an awful long time on this, because the tithe system, when you're a church this large, 22 million people worldwide, and we have a sharing of the tithe, there's a lot that goes into how it's distributed, where it goes. But in general terms, for the tithe given, it goes to the local church through the tithe envelope or online. The local church has an Adventist giving, link where people can give their tithe online. And that ultimately comes to the conference once a month. We retain roughly 2/3, a little over 66%, roughly. Now, granted, there's...
The conference?
The conference.
Okay.
Good question.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the conference retains roughly 66%, and there is money that is returned back, some money that's returned back from the higher organizations. And what I mean by higher organizations, I mean above us, our regional headquarters is we call a union, okay? Mm-hmm. And in this region is the Southern Union out of the Atlanta area. So we send them a portion. They send on to the North American Division a portion. And then they send a portion on to the General Conference. So we have this sharing of the tithe. So roughly, I'm just trying to make it real simple. Conferences retain around 2/3. Higher organizations such as Union, North American Division, General Conference, they retain about 1/3. And that 1/3 they retain, it's not like it just sits there in their office. It's put to use. Some of it's sent back to local entities, some of it's sent overseas, and some of it's utilized to pay people who work out of that office. So that's kind of how the tithe flows.
Mm-hmm.
But then beyond that, you have offerings, and there's all kinds of offerings. But I'll mention at the world field level, you have what's called world budget, and there's roughly 18 or 19 entities or offerings that benefit within world budget. They all get a little percent of the world, of every dollar that comes in, they get a percent. So a lot of it goes to missions. Over 50% goes to missions for world budget. But in addition to that, you have Voice of Prophecy, a ministry we're all familiar with, gets some of it. The Hope Channel gets some of it. Disaster Relief gets some of it. So it goes to bless Andrews University or Oakwood College or Oakwood University. It goes to bless them too. So it's used in a number of different areas, and so that's spread out in a number of different areas. And then you have at the local conference, once again, you have a number of offerings, but on that offering, I'll call it Kentucky Advance Offering, Kentucky-Tennessee Advance Offering.
Okay.
And the Kentucky-Tennessee Advance Offering, the biggest portion goes toward evangelism, 40%.
Wow.
I think 37.5% goes to Highland Academy, 12.5% goes to Madison Academy, or two academies, Madison being a day academy, Highland being, boarding.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the balance of that going to Indian Creek Camp.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So and there's other offerings, but that's kind of a primary. Every conference has an advance offering that stays locally.
Okay.
And then finally, your local church has a church budget. And when people give the local church budget, it's used for evangelism, it's used to pay the light bill, it's used to buy Sabbath school quarterlies, just all those different areas. Just like a family has a budget, your local church has a budget. And so those are some of the bigger offerings. But like I say, there's a lot of different offerings that people can give to support the work.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Why is it important that the church and all the tithing within the church be distributed among the global mission, rather than all of that tithing going directly to support that local ministry or church?
Yeah, that's a question that gets asked quite a bit. In other words, why doesn't the local church, the people who pay tithe through the local church, why doesn't that tithe all come back to the local church? And I guess I'll use maybe a crude illustration here. Imagine a home. You have a husband, you have a wife, you have their children. And you have the husband as the breadwinner, the one who goes to the job, and the wife is a stay-at-home mother. Imagine if when he gets that paycheck, he takes that, cashes it, and he spends it all on himself. Maybe he likes certain hobbies. Maybe he likes certain types of entertainment. Maybe whatever it may be, he spends it all on himself. And there's the poor wife, there's the poor children at home languishing because nothing's been shared. And that's kind of the rationale in terms of a sharing of the tithe within the Adventist church. That money that comes in helps the weaker many times within the Adventist church. It may be that you have a church that's large and has affluent members who can return a strong tithe, but then that money goes to provide pastoral coverage or teachers for another area of the conference that doesn't have that strong tithe base. Or up the ladder, as you get to North American Division General Conference, it may be that tithe can be utilized to share to help parts of the work that are languishing more than other areas where there's more of an abundance. And so it's a really good question, but I do believe that, and I mentioned earlier, with over 22 million members, and that is because of God's blessing, but I also believe it's a sharing structure of the tithe, where by sharing, we're able to grow the work broader throughout a region or throughout a division or throughout the world field, we're able to help those who don't have quite as much in terms of resources, and they don't have the incomes to have much of a tithe that they can return either. So yeah, I think sharing principle is absolutely critical.
Well, that's really comprehensive. It sounds a little, at least for me, a little complicated, but
Yeah, there's a lot of moving
Yeah.
parts.
yeah. So I guess ultimately, how do you, when somebody does tithe, even when they're struggling, and once they understand where their money is going and how it's being used, what can we learn about God and the Bible through our tithing?
You know, when I was growing up, I was blessed with really good parents, and they always provided for my needs. Now, you know, not every child's had that good fortune where they have things provided, but, you know, I always had food to eat. I had clothes they provided shelter and a warm place to stay during the Wisconsin winters, which can get cold, you know. So they always provided for me, and they were always faithful, you know. And I think in terms of when I think about God, you know, He always provides. He's always faithful. I mean, He has ways to provide for us that we can't even imagine. Really, He owns a cattle on 1,000 hills. I mean, we've all heard that term. It's a well-used term, but you know, He and you know what? Back to tithing, in Malachi, it's promised that a blessing will be poured out, but it doesn't identify the blessing. It just says, "Open the windows of heaven, a blessing will be poured out." It doesn't identify the blessing, but it could be physical, it could be relational, it could be financial, it could be any number of things. Or it could be all of the above. And when it comes to financial, it may not be more money, but it may be that He allows you through different mechanisms to save a lot of money. You see what I'm saying? But my experience has been observing others and looking at my experience too, is that the blessing is not minimal when it comes from God. It's very broad-based. So it can touch on all those things that I just mentioned. So, yeah, God is always faithful, and He wants us to be faithful. Another thing in regards to tithing, it's kind of a faith journey, because you have to take that first step in exercising faith. But once you do that, you're able to look back, and it strengthens your faith when you observe what He's done to bless you.